It looks like everything is working good. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Tonight's discussion is all about composting and compost basics. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I just want to remind you of our Feed Your Family boot camp that I do and our 17-week farmer training class, consultations to help you set up your own food producing farm, whether you're producing food for your family or for some for sale if you have a group of people wanting to buy food. And I have my Patreon classes and I have my YouTube videos. So these are many ways that you can learn how to impact your food system better than maybe you are now. And so that is a good thing that you want to be focusing on, are what we have available, and you can find it all at www.georgicrevolution.com. That is my website where you can sign up for these things. Right now we're right in the middle. We're actually getting towards the end, but we're still in the middle of our 17-week farmer training class. I've had 6 different students through the course of the year show up here, and that has been a fun thing. And it's been some neat things. We've had a whole bunch of oral examinations, and these kids are passing with flying colors. It's fun to work with smart, brilliant people who are learning soil health and what makes the chemical reactions happen in the soil because of the proper microbes we have. And that is all we're going to be talking about tonight, is composting and getting those microbes into the soil. But it's been so fun to have these kids here. We have 2 kids that have been here the whole 17 weeks, and then we've had other people coming off and on. And thank you very much to those of you who are supporting me on my Patreon channel. That is a wonderful thing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Here's a picture of my daughter learning the microscope. And she is searching for bacteria, fungus, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, and other fun things that are in there. And this was the look on her face when she saw her first microarthropod. They look like a little spider. And I need to get one on here so you guys can see it. So, compost management. There's a lot of things that we need to manage on our farms. We need to manage what we're doing each day in order to produce food. And compost management is the 5th major thing that we need to be managing. And so there's been a class each week on each of these principles. And so this week is compost management. There's many different ways to make compost. Just pick a method and do it. And you've got to remember that when we're trying to find materials, not all materials are the same for composting. If you're getting manure to make compost out of, you can pretty much use any manure you can find. But using manure straight on your gardens is not necessarily a good thing. I've had people use old rotted manure. They thought it was good compost, and it was not. So we need to make sure that we are actually actually going through the process of getting rid of the bad microbes that we find in certain starting materials that we would put in a compost. If you can use earthworms to make your compost, you will have a superior compost. Always use earthworms. When you are finished with your compost, you would use your compost as a starter to make new gardens. You can use it as an inoculant to get the microbes onto land that you're already producing from. So if you already have a garden. What I like to do on all of my garden beds is to add about 1 inch of soil a year. So in my greenhouse, I may be growing 4, maybe even 5 crops in one space, but still only once a year I would apply the compost. Not each time you plant the crop. You just don't need that much usually. And sometimes you don't even need 1 inch a year, but that's a good rule of thumb. When When I focus on compost, I'm always thinking of the microbes that I'm growing. I don't make compost to be a plant nutrient. If you were creating a plant nutrient, meaning a fertilizer out of your compost, it's usually ready in 3 to 6 months. But I try to get my compost to go to 12 to 16 months because then it collects a larger number of the beneficial bacteria and fungus. If we can get more microbes, like lots more of the fungus and bacteria. Instead of say 25,000, maybe we want 500,000 different species in that compost. And when we can get up to those numbers, then we have a very, very good good biomass of that of those organisms that will really change the soil and make the soil very healthy. That's what we're looking for. So if we make compost teas, we can multiply the amount of compost. So if we end up with a 5-gallon bucket of compost in our finished product, we could make maybe 100 gallons of a compost tea by multiplying the microbes. And so there's a whole process of doing that. We're not going to go into that tonight. It would take too long for this one class to talk about teas and extracts. Remember that when you're turning composts, if you are doing a compost that you turn, it kills fungus. So you want to turn it a minimum amount of times. 3 times is a good number, maybe 8 times. Most of my composts that I turn them anywhere from 5 to 8 times, and then I stop. I don't turn it anymore. And then I put worms in it, and the worms eat it. And so that thermophilic stage, thermophilic means hot. So that's one of the methods of composting, is a thermophilic compost. And you would mix up your materials. You'd have 10%, and that's actually on the next slide here. You'd have 10% high nitrogen materials to get the compost hot quick. You'd have 30% green materials, which would be green growing plants. And then you'd have 60% brown materials. Those are things like wood chips. And so you would mix that up. You would get it to about 50 to 60% moisture. And then it would heat up to 131 degrees or 100 and all the way. It could go up to over 190, but that's too hot. You want to keep it in that 130 to 170 range, and you want to turn it at certain intervals of time so that you maximize the microbes and the oxygen in that pile, so that you have a pile that stays aerobic. You never want your compost to go anaerobic. So that would be thermophilic composting. You heat it up to 100, and when it heats to 131, and it just heats naturally, you don't do anything to heat it up. You just make the pile. In 2 or 3 days, it should be getting hot. And that's a thermophilic compost. And then you turn it 2 or 3 times, or to 6 or 10, whatever it takes, until it stops heating up. Once the thermophilic stage is over, you would add worms. And any compost system that we have worms in is called a vermicompost. Vermi is just the Latin word for worm, so it's a worm compost. So you can make a thermophilic compost. It heats up, you go through the turning phases, and that does 2 important things. It kills disease-causing organisms, and it kills weed seeds. So if you have materials that are filled with weed seeds, do a thermophilic compost. If you have materials that don't have weed seeds in them, then you could just put them directly in a vermicompost and let the worms digest it all. The third method of composting would be a static pile, and that's where you just gather everything together and you put it in a big pile. You keep your moisture somewhere around 70%. And after a couple of years, you would have a compost pile that's finished. It will go anaerobic for a while, and then it will turn around and be aerobic. And the way that you know when it's time to use it is when it doesn't stink anymore. You dig deep into that pile, and it has a good aroma. It smells good, like a forest floor. That means it has gone aerobic again. And then, like I say, it'll be 1.5 to 2 years when that happens, and then it will be ready to go. So that's one type of a static pile. The other kind of static pile is an aerobic static pile, where you would have air shafts going down in the pile about every foot. and then it will stay aerobic because oxygen will penetrate in 1 foot. And so if you have a big pile, but you have all these air shafts going in, just holes going straight down, then that keeps it from going anaerobic. So that also would be a static pile. And if you use worms, it's also a vermicompost. And then number 4 is the tumbler. People sell those compost tumblers. I am not a fan of those because they make small batches. People generally don't they don't really manage them too good. They don't make enough compost to make it worth the work to go out there and turn the tumbler. It seems like a great idea, but I have never really seen one work super wonderful. When you get done, you have from a big filling the thing up, you get a little bit of compost. It's not that much. So they're a nice idea, but I've never seen them work super good. And then there's the bins where you just have some kind of, and here again, it's like a commercial thing you would purchase. And a lot of times people put worms in those, like a vermicompost bin. And they're very small. It's something you would have in your postage stamp size yard in the city or whatever. So tumblers and bins, I don't really like them because they don't produce enough compost to really supply a family's needs. Although they can be good, and I shouldn't be negative, it's just that if somebody's really serious about making a good, proper compost, there's better ways to do it than using a tumbler or a bin. There is a thing called a Johnson-Su bioreactor. Now that is both a static pile and a vermicompost. And there's videos about how to do that online, and you can look that up and watch that. But it is a very good. Let's just define really quickly what the greens, browns, and high nitrogens actually are so that you can go out and gather materials in your own area. Greens would be any kind of a green living plant. Things like hay that was cut and dried and then put somewhere safe so it wouldn't get wet. Those would be green materials. Now, if it is alfalfa hay, that's actually going to be a high nitrogen. Most alfalfa is high nitrogen. Most all of your other types of forages that are made into hay would be a green component. So grass clippings would be green. Leaves from trees that were cut off green, those are going to be greens. Now, browns, what are browns? Browns are woody things. So let's just stay on the leaves from trees for a minute. In the fall, when leaves die naturally, the chlorophyll leaves the leaf and goes into the plant. And so the leaves turn a pretty color. They are dried. They fall to the ground. Those are browns. So what about wheat, oats, barley? When a farmer goes out to his field and he cuts the grain on a plant that has already died, the plant is yellow. The scriptures say the field is white, all ready to harvest. When you have fields of grain that are mature and the grain is ready to harvest, the straw that comes from those are a brown material. The green living part of that plant is gone. It has matured. It has died away. And so what we have are the browns. So it's woody things. Those are the chains of carbon are very long. They're big. So there's lots and lots of carbon in the browns, and there's a lot more protein in the green materials. Okay, so that's where we are on that. Now, high nitrogens are fun. High nitrogens are exciting. And they can be confusing. So let me just confuse you real quick in order to clear up the confusion. High nitrogens are greens. You will never get a high nitrogen component from a dead plant material. High nitrogens are a green living plant of some kind, or something that has eaten a green living plant. So meat from animals would be a high nitrogen. Seeds from plants, no, they're dormant, but they're not dead. If you plant them, they grow. So seeds are alive. They're just in a dormant stage. Those are high nitrogens. Another high nitrogen thing would be alfalfa hay. Now, if the alfalfa was very old and you cut it in the winter and it never got cut for hay and it turned yellow in the field and all of the chlorophyll went down into the roots, it is no longer a high nitrogen. It is a brown. But normally what we do with alfalfa is we cut the alfalfa as hay, and we cut it early because we want that high protein to feed livestock. And so we cut it when it begins to bloom. And so alfalfa is the most readily available form of high nitrogen to put into your compost component. One more very important thing about these components of compost is we need to know what the browns are and what the greens and high nitrogens are.
Hey, Gord. I think that garbage can needs to get up off out of the street. It's dark and someone could hit it.
Somebody needs to mute themselves. We're hearing about somebody getting run over in the street. Thank you very much. So the browns are the fungal food. We need to remember that if you want to grow fungus, which you do, in your compost, then you need to create lots and lots of fungal food. Give them food to eat so they can grow. So here's what that means. Add a lot of wood chips to your compost or any other type of brown component, okay? Now the greens, what do? They feed bacteria. Bacteria are very easy to grow in a compost. They're very easy to grow in agricultural soils. Bacteria are very easy to grow everywhere. It is not hard to grow bacteria. We certainly need bacteria to start breaking things down, because as they break things down, they begin to get the cycles going that we want to happen. They start the carbon cycle happening. They start the nitrogen cycle happening. We start growing large amounts of these wonderful microbes that will do all of this cycling for us. Why is this important to have these microbes? Well, there's a lot of reasons. First of all, this is the entire point of making a compost. I have an acquaintance in North Dakota, farms 40,000 acres. I've told this analogy before. I'm going to tell it again tonight because it is fantastic. Farms 40,000 acres. Their fertilizer bill is $500,000 a year. I will repeat that. $500,000 a year just for fertilizer. Okay? If your soil is functioning, you do not need fertilizer. There is no purpose for fertilizer at all. If your soil functions, the only time we will ever need a man-made fertilizer in a food-producing system is if our soil does not function. Sometimes people hear me say this and they argue with me and say, oh, I've been farming all my life and we always need fertilizer. That is an invalid argument. And you did not hear what I said, or you did not believe it, or something. Obviously, we are not communicating, because functioning soils function, which means everything in the soil gives the plants everything that they need to do what they do. And this is the entire purpose of managing compost, is because we can take the compost, we can restore the function to the soil, and you can do that in 30 seconds. If it's a 100-acre field, maybe an hour. Because you've got to get that compost extract out there. You get those microbes from the compost onto the land. Sometimes it takes one application. Sometimes it takes 4 or 5 applications. It just depends on the conditions. And then you are never making compost again in your life, as long as you can keep the colonies of microbes healthy and happy. And this is something that people miss about compost management. They often think, well, it's so hard to create a good compost, I can't do that every year. You don't have to do it every year. Once you restore the microbes to your soil that should have been there in the first place, and then you can maintain them. You can maintain the microbes. And that's a whole different class on how to do that. We're just going to keep on compost tonight. But we maintain the living habitat for those microbes, and it's easy to maintain it, and you can maintain it for thousands of years. We know that's true because the redwood forest is still there, and it's thousands of years old. So we know that ecosystems like this exist on the earth. And the redwoods is one example of hundreds of ecosystems that have been around for a long, long time. Some of the worst land in the world is made naturally. And some of the worst land is made by humans, by mismanagement. Not because they're bad humans, it's just they simply didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know the effects of their actions upon the land. But now that we know a lot more about ecology, this is fantastic and wonderful, because what I am telling you is we can create a compost, we can catch these living, beautiful, wonderful mineralizers, which are bacteria and fungus, and there's hundreds of thousands of species of these microscopic guys. We can catch them in the compost, we put them in our soil, we keep them alive in the soil by managing our farm properly, and then we never buy fertilizer again. So my friend with 40,000 acres in North Dakota, like 6 years ago, he was paying $500,000 for fertilizer. Well, in the last 6 years, fertilizer has gone up 300%. And I think last year was his last year purchasing any fertilizer because he has got weaned off. And so this is incredible for him. It's too bad all farmers in the world haven't weaned themselves off of man-made expensive fertilizers, because a 300% increase is putting people out of business. One of the largest demographics of suicide in the United States is farmers. And it's because they're so stressed out because there's all these reasons, but one reason is they can't make a living. Fuel is too expensive, fertilizer is too expensive, everything's too expensive. Except there's a lot of farmers out there who are creating functional soils exactly the way that I'm explaining it here in this compost management class. And they are no longer paying out that money. And so now they are paying off their debts and they are living quality lives. The divorce rate is going down. And farmers this year, I guarantee you there are farmers this year who for the first time are taking their families on vacations because they can afford it. And that is a win for all of humanity. Let me see about another slide here. Here's a picture of my compost. Notice it looks like mostly wood chips, which it is, because this is 60 to 70% wood chips, because I want to grow a lot of fungus, because fungus in a compost extracted from the compost and added to agricultural soil is going to mineralize the sands, silts, and clays into plant food. No longer do we need to purchase fertilizer. Every element in there, all 40 something elements that plants eat. I say 40 something because we're discovering new things all the time, and I don't want this to be obsolete in 30 years when we discover new plant nutrients. So the molybdenum, the calcium, the zinc, the iron, the boron, all of those things that are in the soil that plants can't get because they are tied up in a chemical way that plants can't absorb them, the fungus makes it available. We call that process mineralization. So the fungus mineralize, and they will give the plants things they need. There is a fascinating group of fungus called mycorrhizal fungi, and they will give plants water. So on a drought year, the mycorrhizal fungi will attach itself to a tree root, and then it will go hundreds of yards. Even though it's microscopic, the hyphae, the little filament, the hyphae in that fungus are massively long. In fact, fungus is the largest organism on Earth. And those hyphae will go out and they will stretch out to all of the plants in the field. They will take water from the tree, from deep down in the aquifer, and they will give it to all of the plants who are feeding the fungus sugar. Pretty awesome. But if we use fungicides and spray our fields and we kill the fungus, now we have to do all that work to grow a crop. Instead of working with Mother Nature, we now have to become the mother to each of our little baby children that we plant in the soil as a wheat seed. And if we have 70 billion wheat seeds growing on our big old farm, we have to take good care of them because we have killed all of the natural things that would have taken care of them anyway. Okay, what else can we see in this this picture here? That is me. That's my hand. I'm getting down there. Wonder if we can see an earthworm in here. Probably not, but I do put earthworms in my fungus once it cools off past the thermophilic stage. Let's go to the next picture, see what we can see. There's the compost pile. I have a lot of different ways of doing compost. This is a thermophilic compost. So I take the wire ring off of the pile of compost and I put it on a new fresh pallet, and then I rip the old pile down and I take the hot middle, put it on the bottom in the pallet. That's how it looks right now. That hot middle is going in to the bottom, and then the top and sides that I tore down on the ground, those go in the middle, and then the bottom goes on top. And then I keep that same rotation going all the time. And this is how I turn my compost. And then when it gets done with the thermophilic stage, I fill it with earthworms, and it goes from a great compost to an exceptional, wonderful, glorious compost. And then we have the garden. Once a year, we add about 1 inch of compost to the soil surface. And this is just a random picture of a bed in the greenhouse in the winter time when I'm trying to get carrots to grow. But this is what the soil would look like after it has 1 inch of compost on it. Now, if you didn't want to put the compost on, for whatever reason, you could still get the microbes in there by putting on an extract. And that's where you would take your bucket of compost, mix it with water, and then you would just pour the water out there on the soil. How do we actually use the compost? Oh, I think we've already covered this, but here it is because I know some of the people looking at this like to take screenshots of this or take a picture of it with your phone. But we spread it on there 1 inch thick annually. We make an extract to pour on plants. We don't pour it at all. That's obviously a typo. Brew a E. Yeah, we need to brew an E. It's supposed to be a T. Somebody should. Where's an editor? You know. Microbes in the soil. That is the key. We need microbes in the soil. Microbes is the entire point of compost. Compost is not potting soil. Compost is not a solid that you use that much. It's all about the microbes. And so if you send me a compost sample and I look at it in my microscope and I tell you there is no life in it, you probably all you have is a potting soil. It's not a compost. The word compost means lots and lots of microbes from the soil food web, which will make the soil function so that you have the best nutrient dense food in the world that is growing from that soil. The other thing is microbes on the plant surfaces. We want lots and lots of microbes on plant surfaces. If you happen to be a germaphobe, I don't mean that in a bad way, but there are germaphobes in the world. There are people who are afraid of germs. Then you are probably freaking out right now about me saying that microbes should be on plant surfaces. Well, we obviously don't want a microbe that would make you sick. But if your plant is thriving and healthy, then you will thrive and be healthy. So it didn't have the disease-causing microbes on there. But let me just share with you a fascinating truth. Now, this is a truth as far as we understand science. And it's pretty solid. This truth is about as solid as the law of gravity. So in the future, science may be able to unveil that gravity has some flaws and things don't actually work the way that we think they do. But as far as engineering and playing sports and walking around and getting out of bed in the morning or her feet hitting the floor, the law of gravity is pretty sound. So back to microbes, the law I'm going to tell you is pretty sound, just as sound as the law of gravity. The disease-causing germs live in anaerobic conditions, which means very low or no oxygen. So if we are eating a plant that has been growing in an oxygen-rich environment, both its roots and its stems and its leaves and its flowers and its fruits, if it's in a high oxygen environment, we don't have to wash the bugs off, the dirt off. We don't have to sanitize it because there's nothing there except very beneficial microbes. One of the #1 causes of modern sickness is the lack of healthy microbes inside of our digestive tracts. Our food is so incredibly clean of any microbe that we are dying as modern people because we don't have the right microbiome in our guts to do what they're supposed to do. My students the other day were pulling carrots out of the ground, which was a very oxygenated, very functioning, good soil, and they were eating them with all kinds of dirt on them. And I was thinking, good for you. You will live a long, healthy life. If you have issues with your DNA, epigenetics is going to start happening. And if you don't know what that is, look it up. Look up epigenetics. Your genes will be turned on to reprogram things. Stuff you thought you inherited from your parents can go away. The old idea of genetics of, oh, I was born with this, that is not current truth. That is not current science. If you think it is, you need to do some research and come up to speed with the current science that we know now. Does that mean it's true? It is until another scientist proves it different and we learn more. We're continually learning. But right now we know that we can reprogram DNA. It's called epigenetics. So eating the carrot from a functioning soil, getting the microbes in us, having the right foods to turn on the proper DNA, things like kale, things like garlic, other brassicas. Garlic's huge, and then all the brassica family. Kale is probably one of the best ones, though. Those turn on genetics within us that heal old problems that were passed to us from parents and grandparents. A lot of times this stuff skips a generation. If your grandparents were doing certain habits, men have certain problems, meaning mankind has certain problems. Grandfathers who smoked, grandsons often have a low sperm count. Weird, isn't it? I don't even know how true that is. I just am on lots of webinars and I hear lots of weird things. So is that one true? I have no idea. But it's worth studying. It's worth learning about. So when my students are out there eating these dirt-covered carrots, I'm excited because they're going to have healthy kids and grandkids. We can build a new, very healthy group of people. See, in the last 200 years, we have almost eradicated communicable diseases. So contagious diseases almost gone, not completely, but I mean, 150 years ago, you would get sick and die. It was very uncommon for the majority of your kids to make it to adulthood because of contagious diseases. But nowadays, most people live life and don't die from a contagious disease. But what we are dying from is our bodies simply are not working right. And we call those things, those diseases, the autoimmune diseases. So communicable diseases are on the decrease drastically, and the autoimmune diseases are on the rise drastically. Why? How come? Here's why. Well, and I certainly don't know all the answers why, but as far as it has to do with compost, is that we don't have the nutrition in our bodies, and we don't have the microbiome in our bodies to turn on the right genetics within us so that we can be healthy. Our genes don't get turned on. What turns on a genetic in a human being? Does anybody know the answer? If you want to unmute yourself, you could type it in the chat. I better turn my chat on. What turns on genetics in our bodies? Genetics to fight disease, genetics to make us superhuman. What turns it on? And this is new science. We haven't known this for a long time. Plato, Aristotle, Newton, these guys didn't know this stuff. This is brand new stuff. It is viruses. The good, the healthy, the beneficial viruses. Let me repeat that. The good, the healthy, the beneficial viruses are the ones responsible for turning on the genetics that heal our bodies. And no, I'm not just talking about the immune system when I say heal. Much deeper than that, on the genetic level, not on, oh boy, a white blood cell is going to overtake a germ. That's not what I'm talking about when I say healing. But we have to have functioning soils that create the most nutrient dense foods, both vegetable and animal foods. And then we need to be consuming a large diversity. If we eat 3 plant species a week, we are starving to death with full bellies. We should be eating dozens of plant species a week. And these plant species should be covered with all kinds of microbes. Obviously beneficial ones. And it worries me. A lot of these people were worried about coronavirus, which they should have been, because it was killing lots of people. And then they found out that if they took ivermectin, it would kill viruses. And so there were a bunch of people going to veterinarians buying ivermectin, which is it's a drug you can get from veterinarians for cattle and sheep, horses, goats, blah, blah, blah. And they were taking it, and was it killing coronavirus? Yes, it was. What other viruses was that killing? That's what worries me. That's my question. And I don't have an answer. Was it killing all the beneficial viruses that may take a decade to build up in a healthy colony within our bodies? So anyway, I'm talking a lot about a lot of stuff tonight that is probably somewhat speculative. I am the first to admit that. But it's interesting, if we are not on the cutting edge of asking questions, we are behind the science of what we are actually learning. I love being a scientist. I love asking the questions. Let's go right here. Okay, so I really like this picture. We can know what's happening inside of our compost, in our garden soils, on the surface of our foods, in the roots of our food, in the tissues of our food. We can see what is happening with a $300 microscope. If you come to my classes, I'll teach you what you're looking for. It's pretty simple. A person can learn in one day. It is pretty awesome. Okay, we've got some questions. My first question actually came to me on Facebook. How the heck do I find Facebook? I'm going to stop sharing. And now I am going to go to Facebook. I'm going to look up a question. And here it is. So this is a super great question. This is from Helena. I never can say your name right. I'm sorry. Helena, that's how we say it. Quick question, if you have time for during your Q&A tonight. I have time. I'm reading the Gene Logsdon book, Small Scale Grain Raising. Good job, great book. And loving it. He does often talk about crop rotation, and quite often he has clover in the rotation. I've always considered clover an obnoxious weed. What would be the benefit of growing it? Should I grow it? What do you do with it? Do you personally grow it? Would you recommend it? Okay, so the question goes on. There's like 20 questions in here. Okay, Helena, I love Gene Logsdon's book. The reason you would grow clover, let's grow a short clover. Let's go with a white Dutch clover that's going to get 4 to 8 inches high, usually 4 to 6 inches in a very high functioning soil, maybe 8 inches high. The grains are going to outgrow it. All right. The clover is going to be short. It's going to be a cover crop on top of that ground. In the permaculture world, there are 7 layers of plants, one of which is a ground cover. That would be the covering. It's going to cool the ground. It's going to keep the ground warmer in cool weather. It'll keep it cooler in hotter weather. So it's an insulating barrier. It's going to be putting out major amounts of exudates into the soil, feeding the microbes. What microbes do exudates feed? 2 groups. It feeds the bacteria, it feeds the fungus. Bacteria and fungus are both mineralizers. They're going to be breaking down the sand, silts, and clays and then what do they do with the sand, silts, and clays? They give it directly to the plant roots. What plant roots are they going to give it to? They're going to give it to the clover, but yes, they will also give it to your grain. So by growing clover, you will be feeding your grain extra fertilizer. So the old idea of weeds are bad, get rid of all weeds, is an old bad idea. We still believe it widespread in the world today. It's going to take the older generation dying off before we can move forward with society. The only reason I say that is not to be mean to the old generation. It's just that when you read history, that's what happens. If there's a widespread societal belief, it takes 20 years for beliefs to change. So that's something that's going to have to change. Weeds are not bad. Weeds are our allies. Now, if weeds get giant and huge and they shade out and destroy your crop, then you had the wrong combination of weeds. So do weeds need management? Sure. The other thing, clover is it's a legume, all legumes are nitrogen fixers. So they have a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium, which is a bacteria, and on the nodules of the clover plant, the rhizobium is going to go inside of the plant. It's going to be an endo. They're going to be endophytic. They're going to go inside that root, and they're going to create nitrogen inside there. Well, is the nitrogen good for your clover? Yes. Is it good for your grains? Yes, but not this year, because they're not going to let it go while the clover is still living. The clover would have to go through death, and then in the soil, that nitrogen would be released for the next plants growing. So that is a tricky one, because a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to grow a legume with my plant and it'll feed it nitrogen. Well, okay, it will get nitrogen, but it's probably going to be getting nitrogen from azospirillum or azobacter or a different organism, not rhizobium, that's living and working with in symbiosis with a legume. So legumes are way overrated. All of the gardening books are always screaming about legumes. Even Gene Logsdon here is saying to use it. So yeah, I would use it for sure. It's a good plant to grow, but not so much for the nitrogen benefit for the crop you're growing this year. We could spend probably a 3-hour class on what a living cover plant should be. So there are cover crops, there are green manure crops, there are living cover plants that stay living, perennials. So it looks like a lawn or a pasture, and you go plant your food-bearing crops right in that. And with the right combination of the right kind of plants, you can have a wonderful harvest. But who's doing this? Where are the case studies? There are a few gardeners, science researchers around testing these things. What I want to see that I don't know of yet, I want to see somebody with 40,000 acres and 7 or 8 300 horsepower John Deere tractors to manage that much land out there with a living cover plant on top of that entire acreage, and they're growing commodity crops that are super nutrient dense, that are going to General Mills so that our Twinkies are healthier. Thank you for the applause. Now, where are we going? What do you do with the clover? Just let it grow, let it go through its cycle. And yes, I've played with these types of things. And we need to do more. We need 40,000 people worldwide on every continent, even Antarctica, who are trying these types of new technologies. Scientifically, they work. Practically, how do we make them applicable in our own food production systems? How do we feed the people? And we don't quite have those answers yet. Okay. But what Gene Logson's doing, he's growing them in rotation. So he's going to be plowing his field and so he would probably have clover. The next year he would have wheat. The next year he may have alfalfa. The next year he may have oats. I don't, I would have to go back and review the book to see if he's actually growing them at the same time. Now, certainly what you would do when your plants get big, you could plant them at the same time, and then you would harvest the grain off, and then the legume grows up, and maybe he would leave it in a pasture for 3 or 4 years and graze sheep on it. That would be a very normal way to do it. Sheep, cattle, goats, whatever, because clovers would make a good pasture for that. And I think I've already talked about the rest of your question. Let me just read it here so we make sure we get it all. He also has alfalfa in a rotation. I find that interesting since it's a perennial plant. Wouldn't it just keep coming up when you are trying to grow other grains? Yes, and I think I just said that. That's why you plant it with the grain, is you want that perennial to keep growing for 5 to 10 years. It feels like alfalfa should be a field you leave, but is that a product of where I live? Yeah, that's just the common way of doing it everywhere, I think. What are my recommendations? Set up 10 plots and do it different in each plot and see which one works the best. Become one of the researchers for the next generation. That's my recommendation, which probably wasn't helpful for your personal garden. Sorry. Also, you grew up here in southern Utah. What grains and varieties of them do you remember growing well in our climate? I don't see a lot of grains growing here except corn and silage. So just I don't even remember those varieties. Here's what I did in my climate this year. I had about 12 different varieties of different grains. I grew them out to see which ones did well. Some of them did great. Some of them didn't do so good. Just buy a packet of seed of different types of grain, and then grow them and see which ones do good in your area, you know. Besides, I was there 30 years ago. Things have changed in 30 years. Microclimates are different. So even if I knew a variety then, it may not even do that good now. The stuff in the world has changed that much. It really has. Okay. Let me see. Let me go to the chat here. Here's a question from Parker. Parker, how you doing? Parker was one of my students for a couple of weeks during our 17-week course. So excited. So Parker asks, is there anything we can do to stop the white powdering fungus on our zucchini plants? No, there's not. Airflow. I just said no, and then I gave you the answer. But I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to put a bunch of fans out there on your 5 acres of zucchini? I know you don't have 5 acres, but how practical is it to put a fan outside? If you're in a greenhouse, you need fans. Maybe you're in a greenhouse. Airflow is the key to get rid of that powdery mildewy stuff. All right. So if your plants are planted too closely together, a lot of times the air can't flow, it can't get around them. So next year, remember that and plant your plants further apart. If you have weeds in there, pull them out so you have more airflow. And that's a tricky one because in a greenhouse, you want to cram things as close together as possible. Parker also said, mushrooms are a good sign of fungus. What about mushrooms in your grass? Is that good? Absolutely. It's just showing that the fungi is alive and well in your grass. They're going to be mineralizing, so you don't have to fertilize your grass. Your grass is going to be growing and thriving and doing very well. Mushrooms are just fine. So that's a good sign. It's a good sign. When you walk out on your land, I don't care if you have a postage stamp size yard or 75,000 acres. When you walk across your land and you see mushrooms blooming, that means you have arrived at a level of soil health that most American farmers have not arrived at yet. You are ahead of the game. That is a good thing. You want to see mushrooms growing. If a greenhouse is shut for winter, will it get enough oxygen, or do you need to let air in during the day? I never worry about letting air in a greenhouse in the winter. So letting air in isn't the problem. The problem is no airflow. See, plants don't have a diaphragm. That when we contract our diaphragm, our lungs fill with air and we take a big breath. It looks like this. And then you exhale. Okay. Plants can't do that. Plants don't have lungs. They don't have a diaphragm to inflate their lungs. And so they just sit there waiting for the wind to blow. So it's way more important in a greenhouse to have a fan going in the wintertime when it's shut, so that the air will blow past the plant, because the airflow is what pushes the carbon dioxide into the leaf so that photosynthesis can happen. Photosynthesis cannot happen unless air goes into the leaf. All right, hopefully I answered those questions for you. Okay, Leslie asks, any idea as to why contagious diseases used to be so dangerous? Yes. Vaccines, as many anti-vaxxers as there are in the world, vaccines have actually got it under control. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people. I mean, it's pretty fun to talk about how wonderful it is to be an anti-vaxxer. I've never got any vaccinations, and people seem to be proud about that. And there's a lot of conspiracy out there, whether it's true or false. I still put it in the conspiracy camp because of the way people talk about it and the way it's written. I mean, thank Louis Pasteur. We simply understand how to control disease. If the immune system in a person's body is able to fight off a disease, it doesn't kill us. And that's what a vaccine does. I've worked in the medical industry for a lot of years now. I worked for a veterinarian for a long time. I was one of those people, me and my wife, we did not vaccinate our kids until they were older. And it made sense to me because I understand livestock. And if you give a baby calf all the vaccines in like its first month of life, it doesn't build any antibodies. It doesn't do anything with them. It doesn't know what they are. But does it have, does the calf still have resistance? Does it still build immunity? Absolutely. How does it do that? All of the science we have and all the vaccines that we have invented that we use on cattle, they don't do a thing for the calf. But it builds immunity because of the milk it gets from its mother. It gets amazing immunity from the milk. So, I mean, in a natural system, it's working and it's working good. Later on, when a calf is 3, 4, 5, 6 months old, and you give it vaccinations, it helps a lot. There's a disease out there called blackleg. And if it's exposed to cattle, they're dead. They plop over dead by the hundreds. If the herd is well vaccinated, they're just fine. You never know that there's an outbreak of blackleg, but it's there. It's running rampant and wild, but the cattle are immune to it because the immune system has built up all the little guys in the bloodstream. They know what to do because they've had the vaccine. So yes, the vaccines simply work. So the reason contagious diseases were so dangerous before is people's immunities, they didn't have the antibodies present in the bloodstream to fight the disease. And so the body would start to fight it, and the disease took over and killed them before the body could figure out what to do. And so that's why the contagious diseases were so deadly in the past. And I attribute that, I'm pretty sure my opinion is 100% to good old Louis Pasteur and the great scientists, the great reductionist scientists of our time who have figured out the details. I know I've just finished writing my book, and I talk extensively about the reduction science and how because of reduction science it has hurt the way we produce food. But at the same time, reduction science has created so much in the benefits of human health and happiness and life. It's not that reduction science is bad. It's that if that's all we have, we become narrow-minded. We need the entire picture. We need holistic science just as much as reduction science. Anyway, those are my thoughts, Leslie. Helena, thank you so much for your answers. Okay, great. That is our last question on here. If anybody else has any more questions, go ahead and ask them. If you don't have any more questions, I should stop ranting and raving before my red personality offends somebody here tonight. Our purpose here is to pass on the best information we know. And the very best information we know is called truth. We want truth. Okay? Oh, here's a truth. I should just end with this. We vaccinated our kids once they were like 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. I think they were much younger than that when we got them a tetanus shot, because we have horses, and horses are a carrier of tetanus. They don't necessarily die from tetanus, but they were pretty little. I think we had our 2 or 3 year olds go in. We got them tetanus shots and stuff, and a couple of others that were pretty easy to catch. But we lived on a farm. People get cut. It's not uncommon for me to get cut. I got a cut right here on my finger today. Look at that. I get cuts almost every day. I get nicks and cuts and bruises. For somebody to not be up on their tetanus shot they are crazy. If you have ever seen an animal die from tetanus, you will no longer be an anti-vaxxer. Just saying. I've seen animals die from tetanus, and if you know, I hate to say anything about humans, but I would hope that there is no human that ever got tetanus. That is living hell. I have never seen more suffering in my life than an animal with tetanus. Never be afraid of vaccines. Would I give children 30 diseases before they're a month old? No, it's silly. It's silly. Are there things in vaccines that can make people sick? Sure. I agree with that. I think there are. But we do have a loving Heavenly Father who can tell us the right things to do. So we need to ask him. Thank you for this being on here tonight. Hopefully this free class helped you. If you need more information, you can go to my website at www.georgicrevolution.com, and we can conquer the world with a functioning soil if we are all eating the best foods ever. Good night. I love you, and I will be back next week with another wonderful and exciting soil health principle, and I don't even know what it is, so I'm not going to tell you.
Thank you, William.
You're welcome.
Thanks, sweetie.
Thank you. If I knew how to end this, I would. I'm such a computer geek.